All right, we're live. It's been a couple weeks, I think, since my last broadcast. We have a really interesting guest today, someone I've known for probably, I don't know, probably about 10 years. At one point, was a competitor, sold his company to Citrix. I think for a brief while, we were sort of colleagues at Citrix, and now is a co-founder of a really cool, interesting startup in the container microservices space called Rancher. Shannon Williams, welcome to the show.
Hi, Rube. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, you've been doing this a long time. You sort of are able to catch, it seems, every interesting wave in the tech world. This latest one, I guess, is the sort of reemergence of containers as the kind of go-to format for the sort of next generation of cloud apps.
Yeah, it's like you said. It's once you've been around, you start to see the same thing over and over again. And I think I was lucky enough to sort of get into tech during the last big bubble back in the late '90s, when everything was sort of how do we make the internet work and how do we make the internet secure. And so I spent a lot of time working on security early in my career, and it was really only with cloud, back in 2008, that I was able to kind of broaden my perspective, I would say. I think it's often when you work in tech, you work, especially if you're not an engineer, like I'm not a developer, but I've always been either in product roles or sales roles, marketing roles, on the kind of customer facing side of it. You've always been sort of very narrow focused on the topic your company addresses, and trying to really understand whether that, my first company was web application security, and trying to figure out, identity management for early websites, to to dealing with cloud. I mean, you sort of start with a very broad understanding of technology, and then you kind of go really deep. And it was interesting. What I loved so much about cloud.com, and sort of back in 2008, when I first started working and working in the space you were in, was just this opportunity to really look at every single element of the life cycle of how we write, run, and operate an application. And I think that's been the great part of the last 10 years, is thinking about that, steadily progressing, and being able to look, whether it was a cloud or Citrix or Rancher, all these things, been able to look at it really in a very broad way. And I just think that's a lot more interesting than some of the work that I'd done earlier, where it was very, very narrowly focused on solving a very specific problem. So yeah, it's been great. It's great to talk to you like this too. I mean, likewise, it's as you said, we've been kind of in the same circles for so long. It's great to hang out.
So you guys are a startup. You incorporated a couple of years ago. You've done a few rounds of funding. So the business of containers seems to be a good business to be in these days.
I think like most industries, when you're starting a company, it's always about timing. You're kind of, are you too early? Are you too late? When we got involved in containers, it was sort of, kind of late 2014. So Docker had been around for a year or two, but we'd known them even from the pre-Docker days. So we'd kind of been following the project, my co-founders and I, and we were really interested in how containers were going to change and shake up cloud computing. Because I think from our perspective, having worked on cloud stack and built infrastructure clouds, we definitely seen the impact that how difficult it was to build standardization into clouds. Like the idea of my portability and migration, and commonality, and even just writing applications that could be easily upgraded on different platforms and managed and stuff, was just pretty hard. And so the first problem we kind of got into when we started working on containers was, okay, if containers give us sort of this portable bucket that we can put the code in and move our application and its dependencies around with, how would they impact things like storage, or things like networking, things like DNS? Are there infrastructure services that we can also containerize and package and move with them? And that was sort of in 2014, I think that was a really interesting question. As we got into it, I think we very quickly realized that the market was just too early for that. We were talking about transmissions and kind of aftermarket stereos for cars that just didn't exist. And so it sort of very quickly we kind of started looking at the more holistic problem of, okay, what am I going to do with these containers? How am I going to manage them? How am I going to deploy them? We started working really closely with Docker and Kubernetes, and kind of looking at this space as it developed, and kind of understanding what would take to build a real management platform with all of these pieces, sort of a soup to nuts experience. And so by the time we launched Rancher 1.0 in kind of early last year, 2016, what we had done is we'd taken all that infrastructure work we built around networking and storage for containers, and coupled it with a lot of management technology, a lot of the same kind of problems we were solving with cloud computing. How do you manage users, manage resources, provision things, deprovision things, schedule them, deploy them, and built an open source management platform called Rancher. And that really, when we brought it to market, it just kind of, I think, clicked. I think there really wasn't anything out there that was looking at how does a company solve this problem. It was open source. How does it solve the fact that every organization that uses containers is going to have, they're not going to have one cluster. They're going to have dozens of clusters. They're going to run them in different places. They're going to have different teams with different privileges. They're just going to need a management layer that ties around it. And by making Rancher open source, it kind of, the adoption just took off, like sometimes it does with open source projects.
So speaking of taking off, there's been this huge uptake in Kubernetes, which is the kind of container orchestration project that Google came up with. It's been, it's actually been quite amazing to see the level of adoption around that project. What are your sort of feelings of Kubernetes? Do you guys work with them? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're heavily invested in Kubernetes effectively. I mean, we've been working with Kubernetes since 2015. And so for us, Kubernetes is kind of a backbone technology. It's a kernel that we use to build a lot of the management stuff. So inside of Rancher, we deploy Rancher with this concept of environment. So as a user, you sort of start off with a Rancher management, say, okay, I'd like to spin up an environment. Environments are groups of resources paired with a orchestration technique. So we've supported Kubernetes since 1.0. It's been sort of one of the core orchestration technologies we support, Arm, Mesos, but Kubernetes has well outpaced the rest. It's become by far the most popular thing. So we support Kubernetes environments. We have a distribution of Kubernetes, in fact, for our paying customers that get support on Rancher. They get a full supported Kubernetes distribution, and in a lot of ways, that's what people really love. It's basically upstream Kubernetes paired with really good infrastructure management to make it easy to spin up your clusters, to manage your XP, to deploy this cluster into production state and run it and invite your partners, users, whoever it is that's going to be consuming that cluster in, and then back up the entire cluster, recover it somewhere else. So it's really all about managing these clusters and then adding a lot of technology around them, infrastructure technology around them, so that Kubernetes cluster can be spun up on any infrastructure. So we make it very easy to spin it up. Not sort of like, here's a version for VMware, here's a version for Amazon, but rather just give us resources. We'll lay down consistent networking and storage, and then deploy your containers against that. And then you can configure a bit, you can choose what that networking storage will be, but whatever it is, it's consistent. And so that's sort of where a lot of the magic happens. Like, it's not just, kind of, hey, give me a Kubernetes cluster and then map it into the cloud so that I've got a Kubernetes that works great on Amazon, but it's totally tied to that cluster, that cloud provider. Rather, give me a Kubernetes environment that will run anywhere and run equally well on my, server cluster in VMware, on OpenStack, on Amazon or Google or Azure or wherever.
So the Kubernetes ecosystem is certainly vibrant in the developer world. Where do you think we are in the life cycle of sort of actual paying customers and the adoption of larger, later stage type of users? Are we still in the earliest days, or are we starting to see sort of that transformation like we did in the early days of cloud, from the tire kickers and early adopters to the bigger outfits?
I would say we're still in the early phases. Like, realistically, there are tons of deals. There are tons of people buying Kubernetes projects and support, and it's become a big part of our business for sure. It's probably the majority. But I would say we're still pretty early. Like, I'll give you an example. We're working with a really large financial services company on Kubernetes project. But the project is still, there's a handful of teams within that organization using Kubernetes. I would say it's sort of equivalent to, maybe 1/2 of 1% of IT, maybe 1/10 of 1% of the IT of this organization, right? It's like when you think about, a large financial service company and what they do, the percentage that's been Dockerized, that's containerized, that's actually being put on these platforms, still exceedingly small, right? It's an early adopter team, it's web scale architecture team, and they're not. I mean, this is a financial services company. They're maybe more conservative than a web. We have other places, like we're working with a really cool ad tech company in New York, and they just, they migrated everything, 500 servers or so in Amazon onto containers very easily and have moved forward with that. But that's I would say the adoption curve we see in the web services world, in the web companies. It's like, cool, this technology is great. Let's just dive in all the way. When you get into real traditional enterprise, much like it was with cloud, if you remember, we'd build a cloud. I remember doing this at Citrix, like, hey, here's this cloud. And there was initially, there was a handful of workloads that were sort of ready for it. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of people weren't really ready to move. They're like, well, I don't want to move things that are happily running somewhere else. B, I don't really trust this platform. It's new. C, I have other issues that are my priorities besides maybe getting more, reducing costs, getting better density, or getting more ability. So you're still in that phase. Adoption is moving. It's impressive. But it's certainly by no means are we anywhere close to a moment where the number of Kubernetes-ified applications is in any way a significant number. Right? We're still in the very, very early stages, in my opinion.
It's funny, not to pick on any particular old school vendors. We I think both worked at one for a little while. The interesting thing about these sort of VM vendors, they seem to have missed the boat. They love this idea of kind of like the static monolithic virtual machine approach. And when this kind of lightweight adaptive microservice oriented architecture popped up, where you could deploy, a few thousand containers for a few minutes, they basically said no one's ever going to want to do that. And now we're starting to see some of the older school players kind of come around saying, okay, maybe people do want to do that. Why the reluctance from some of these, it seemed like, the big VM vendors were the people to best capitalize on this transformation, yet they did nothing in it. It's kind of just
I mean, it's interesting because none of them have been enormous players and thought leadership in this space for sure. But I know most of them have had teams working on this type of stuff for years. I think it's more a testament, and you and I, spent time in another really good company, great people, but it's very hard in a company where you're generating, billions of dollars in revenue on products, mm-hmm. to ever have enough incentive to get behind a new product that, if it's lucky, if things go really well in the next few years, it might generate a couple $100 million. Right? When you're talking about an organization that has slowed its growth. I mean, VMware, IBM, it doesn't matter who you're talking about, right? They've kind of gotten into this more slow growth market where retention and maximization of profit is the most important thing. And it's just so hard to get behind and stay behind things. I think we saw this most pronounced with VMware in the cloud computing market. I mean, you were dealing with this at the same time we were. I mean, there was a time when we were building CloudStack where our single biggest competitor in deals was potential of vCloud. Right? I remember this. People would be like, "Oh, we really love CloudStack. We love to deploy it and stuff, but our VMware team is saying that VMware is going to come out with something so much better than anything you guys could ever build. It'll only be here in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. And so why don't we just sort of, kind of keep this to a pilot for now or sink this deal? We don't want to do something strategic until we see what VMware might come up with." And it's amazing, right? Because VMware never really came up with anything, but its ability to leverage its install base to maintain that relationship means that it still has vastly more VMs under management than any CloudStack, OpenStack tool. It was really only public cloud that really disrupted VMware and caused it to shift. And so, I think in many ways, and if you look back, what did VMware do? They tried to build a public cloud, and when that failed, they partnered with with Amazon. And so, with this type of technology, I think you're always looking at companies saying, okay, yes, it looks really promising, but they may not even. You think about VMware and all the dancing they did around OpenStack. does it make sense to dive all the way in on something that potentially disrupts their main business when that remains, really like a mole on the body of the IT department? I mean, it's that small, the penetration that we're really talking about right now. So I always kind of try to put my hat on that way and think that if I were them, I would be investing in these things. I totally believe they're going to disrupt their business, and that the long run, this technology is going to have a massive impact. But adoption curves tend to favor those large companies, and they tend to be able to react pretty quickly if they see the market going in a different direction. I mean, they could still buy Docker in a heartbeat, or pretty much anybody besides Red Hat that they want to, if they feel like this really is going to be $1 billion or $100 billion, $10 billion business for them.
Yeah, it's funny because you see Google, they obviously were one of the initiators of the Kubernetes project, and obviously still a key contributor to it. And they were in a position to say, let's do this, let's try to disrupt the market. How are we going to monetize it? I guess their idea was that it would be a kind of onboard for their cloud offerings, I suppose. Again, that's just my own opinion in what their motivations were. And a lot of the key sort of initial sort of founders, creators of this project have gone on to sort of go create their own startups or join other competitive companies. So it's really interesting to see, a company as large as Google use this sort of opportunity, use the opportunity as I don't know, they almost weaponized open source, to sort of create this new opportunity and this new segment in a way that I think we haven't really seen a large company do before. We've seen companies like IBM say, hey, we're going to spend $1 billion on Linux. But the reality was that really didn't have much of an impact on the on the ecosystem of startups and the funding and opportunities for this kind of new market segment. They, in essence, seem to have created a new market segment, not only for IT, but for the startups that sort of are blossoming around this little sort of thing, which is really, I just think is interesting.
Yeah, I think in many ways though, Kubernetes is such an obvious extension of what's happened in Docker that I think it's hard to look at Kubernetes outside of that prism of saying Docker itself created this spark of innovation and like a boom of startups that wanted to go out and do things with this technology and make it work. And Kubernetes, if you went to that first DockerCon where they introduced Kubernetes, really felt like Docker and Kubernetes were going to be a thing that worked together to create, as kind of the kernel of this ecosystem. The runtime, the orchestration piece would work really well. Obviously, Docker and Kubernetes decided to go in different directions, and Docker developed Swarm and really invested heavily in that. And I think that's where you sort of see Kubernetes now appearing almost like a separate ecosystem from Docker because of that splinter. I don't know if that persists. It's hard for me to see that persisting long term. I feel like this is all going to come back together. That doesn't really, not a ton of value in having lots of these pieces. Once a market kind of picks something, it's very likely everything will kind of reconverge. And so, I still think of this as the Docker ecosystem and Kubernetes as being one of the key technologies. And potentially this all kind of come together. Your point about weaponizing open source, I love it, man. I really do feel like that's a great insight because, when Google, invested in Android, I think they did the same thing. They said, look, we can't afford to lose the smartphone handset, whatever the future is of people talking, taking things to get rid of their BlackBerries. And again, we're not going to make any money by selling this OS, but if we get it everywhere, we're going to make a ton of money on search and other pieces that we'll try to make Google the standard in. I think that learning enormously impacted the Kubernetes, decision. And it was really, everyone talks about a big three in cloud computing, but Amazon is so far ahead that I think companies like Google and Azure really had to, and Microsoft really had to do things that were somewhat unnatural, right? If you're Microsoft, that was, complete embrace of Linux and open source and saying our cloud will not be a Windows, PaaS, which what it was back when we were dealing with it all those years ago. That was a fundamental, brilliant, somebody had to just say it and do it and force it through. Satya did, and it happened, and it changed the dynamic and made them a competitive cloud player. And I think for Google, I'm not sure if Kubernetes is that thing yet. I think their hope is that Kubernetes is that thing that will make GCP, clearly a tier one, option for everyone to use as a cloud platform. I think that the challenge they have is, they're obviously, Kubernetes. I think they've done a great job with GKE and having a really, really good Kubernetes implementation in there. But the reality is Kubernetes, like Docker, is very portable technology, and it's designed for that. And so it's hard to tie those two things together to make it really, if you use Kubernetes, you should run it on GCP, because for all the great cloud provider, and it works great on that platform, it works really well on Amazon too. It works really well everywhere. So we don't necessarily, it doesn't really have that same stickiness, and it also doesn't really have the obvious opportunity to monetize with search that something like Android had. So it'll be interesting to see if it is. I think in a lot of ways, what Google's also figured out, and they're figuring it out very quickly, is that what really made Azure and Amazon later on very successful was, not just adding lots of features, but also really understanding the customer relationship needs to happen between a cloud provider and a large customer. I think, a lot of times we think of clouds as being web services that, you and I just go in and register for. But the reality is, if you're an Amazon heavyweight, you're working closely with them, you're a partner, they're adjusting the platform to make you successful. Google got really good at that recently, and I think that's one of the reasons you see them picking up a lot of big customers, and hopefully that will catapult them into a much more competitive market. We'll see a competitive market between those three cloud providers.
Well, it's been really interesting catching up with you here. We need to do these more often. What do you got coming up? You going to be at any conferences? What big events do you have in the pipeline?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, we are, we're always out on the road. We run these things called Rancher Rodeos that are like half day, just come in, brain dump on container, CI, and Kubernetes. And so we tend to do them all over. I think we've got 2 coming up in Europe, or 3 coming up in Europe in July. And then I'll be out at KubeCon and DockerCon in the fall. So I know both of those events are kind of penciled in for sure on the calendar. So looking forward to catching up with you in person, man, grabbing a beer.
Yeah, yes, for sure. I'll definitely be at KubeCon. I'm not sure if my invite is standing at DockerCon. Gotta get back to you on that one.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure once they see the high quality journalism, man, they can't keep you away.
But no hard feelings. The Docker guys are cool. Everyone knows that. Actually, I was meaning to ask you a question on security. Full disclosure, I've been working with a security company out of San Jose, Aparetto. And we're doing a lot of stuff in the sort of securing of microservices and container environments and things like that. What are your thoughts on sort of security in this space?
Man, you're talking. I think you're in a really smart space. In my experience, going back to my very first startup, being in security companies, has always been that as soon as a market starts to take off, you just are always uncovering new challenges for the security teams to deal with, whether it's visibility challenges or it's prevention challenges or it's policy management challenges or user management challenges. I think containers have all those issues and all those challenges. I mean, people are worried about what's in the container. People are worried about which containers can talk to each other, how they can talk to each other. People are worried about encrypting communication channels. People are worried about very detailed policy of actions, who can do what in their cluster. So RBAC down to the lowest level. We're nowhere near. I mean, I can tell you, we work now. Rancher have more than 100 plus customers, more than 10,000 users. At least 1 out of every 5 conversations I have is with a security person asking tough questions about RBAC and how to do more scanning of images and potentially dropping security components in. And so I've been really excited. The last year, there's a big uptick in containerized security companies popping up, and I think some of those are looking at things in kind of your traditional way. They're looking at different types of scanning, and others are taking very innovative approaches. So I'm curious to see which ones gain market traction, which ones become the leading option. I don't think anyone's really kind of defined themselves as the leader in container security yet. So I think it's a wide open market that will probably happen pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's funny because you see a lot of the sort of more traditional players saying, "Hey, we're going to use the same tactics we use to secure VMs or to secure sort of Amazon web services type security." And the challenges that I see, again, I'm completely biased. Everyone knows it, so I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Is the fact that when you're running an EC2 instance, you're not running it for 2 minutes. It's going to live a lot longer, and you don't need to worry about thousands for a few minutes. The nature of microservices, for the most part, there are exceptions to the deployment patterns, are one that are more transient, more fluctuating in nature. And I think that how you secure something that may not exist for more than a minute or two is different. So in immutable infrastructure in a VM environment is maybe a little bit overkill potentially, but in an environment where you only need it for 2 minutes, it's completely logical. So my own personal opinion is the new deployment patterns require a new sort of security paradigm.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think one of the things you said there that really resonates what I hear from customers is the volatility is really high with containers. It's one of the reasons management technology like ours has gotten so popular. And I think that one of the first things that people realize is that their logging, their sort of just visibility and monitoring and ability to tell what happened is a lot lower than it was in the past, right? Just the frequency of change makes it very hard. I mean, even if you're just rotating your logs based on size, you're gonna see things disappear a lot faster. So I think you're onto something. I think a lot of people would be pretty happy to start with just to have really good, intelligent way to get visibility into not just the data flow but like what got created, when was it created, why was it created, who did it, how can I sort of come up with a true history of this application for just analysis after the fact if I have an issue. So I think a lot of people are worried that they're going to have a breach, they're going to have a security vulnerability, and they won't even be able to go back and do a lot of diagnostics. So I mean, we work a lot with companies that are putting in place pretty intelligent logging and monitoring technology around this. But I think it's an area where there's the policies are by no means codified. There's not really a very clear best practices that have been defined. So it'll be interesting to see just the direction people go in that space.
Oh, for sure. So where can our viewers learn more about you, follow you on all the social medias and whatnot?
You can always just find us at rancher.com. I'm on Twitter, pretty regularly at SMW355. And, mostly if you're just interested, one of the best places to follow us is on YouTube. We run a monthly online meetup. It goes sometimes 2 hours. I mean, we just get great people to come talk, and we talk about all sorts of things related to Kubernetes and Docker and CI and microservices. You can go to our channel. We've probably got 20 of them, 25 of them now. We've been doing it for about 2 years. And like this month, we're doing it with GitLab, and we're talking about CI with GitLab and using it as your Docker registry and how GitLab works with Kubernetes and containers to get a really nice, tight little package. And so, yeah, anytime, they're all free, they're all recorded, they're great. I run them with my co-founder Darren Shepard, and we just talk, interview, demo. They're kind of live demos. Half of them the demos break, but it's funny. I mean, the greatest thing about what you're doing, Ruve, and the world we're in now, it's like people just want authenticity. They just want to see, like, the last thing people care about is whether the demo works perfectly. They want to understand the concepts. They're all engineers. They just want to see it all work. And so we kind of figured that out early on, and we just said, look, come as you are. We'll do our best. We're going to make it all live. We'll never can a demo. We'll just show you it really how it works, and then if you have questions, we won't leave until your questions are answered. And it's been really popular. We usually get about 2,000 registrants every month, hundreds and hundreds of people coming, and thousands and thousands of views afterwards. So it's pretty cool.
Wow, that sounds great. Yeah. We should do a security one sometime. It's the kind of thing I like to do.
We'd love to have you. In fact, we've been talking about doing it. The New Vector guys had asked about it, and Twistlock had said, hey. And so a couple months ago, we did a really fun one where we had all the monitoring vendors. That was like a specialist on Prometheus, Sysdig, and Datadog. And we called it like the Great Monitoring Bake Off. And we just sort of let them pitch their stuff, and the audience ask questions. that we would moderate, and it went for a couple hours. Everybody did fun demos. They showed the technologies, and it was very cordial and great experience. A lot of people watched that, and within 2 hours, really compare these different options. Like, what does it take to really run Prometheus if you don't, it's not a hosted service? How do you go and deploy it yourself? What can you do with Sysdig? So love to do that with security. Love to kind of dive into, because one of the things about security that's always the case is, unlike say monitoring, where you kind of are comparing three apples, at least reasonable apples. Security is so different. Everyone takes such different approaches. They solve different elements. They, very rarely do you get a market that's mature enough that you have startups sort of competing with almost exactly the same thing. You'll have just very different approaches to securing containers. So it's a great opportunity to get a bunch of people talking and show, both opportunities to layer security and how these different securities might work really nicely together to protect you if you're making a big investment in security, or maybe what you should prioritize first. So love to have it.
All right, well, let's make that happen. Again, thanks for taking the time and talking to me today. I really appreciate it. This broadcast will also be broadcast on Periscope and Twitter, probably in the next hour or so. Feel free to retweet and all that kind of stuff. Next week, I'm going to be in the Bay Area at the Velocity conference O'Reilly puts on. I think it's focused on infrastructure and related technology, so it should be interesting. If you are interested in being a guest on the show, feel free to ping me on Twitter @Ruve. I'm always looking for interesting people to talk to, do these types of back and forths. Demos are great. Shannon, thanks again for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it. You guys are doing some really cool stuff. Check them out at Rancher Labs. Definitely a company that I'm keeping my eye on. I think they're going to be doing some great stuff. They've done it before. They're going to do it again. I'm sure I'm going to see a big exit in their future, to probably another big company. So really exciting space to be in right now. And thanks again for tuning in today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Till next time. Bye.